There is one question that if posed at any time in the past, if posed at this moment present, or at any time into the far distant, in fact we could say the eternal future, the answer to the question would always be the same. Question: who is the Supreme Being? And the answer, of course, is always going to be, as it always has been in the past, Jehovah God. And there are good reasons to say that. When describing Jehovah, the Bible uses the prefix grand. It calls Jehovah the Grand One, the Grand Maker, Grand Creator, Grand King, Grand Instructor, Grand Master. Now, we just use that word in an everyday sense, but the original term really indicates that Jehovah is without any comparison to anyone else. And there are at least 7 different ways that Jehovah is without comparison. For instance, his authority. Now we know that Jehovah is delegated out judging to his Son Jesus Christ. But the ultimate giver of standards as to what is right and what is wrong, what is not acceptable, what is acceptable, it is Jehovah God. Every living being is accountable to him. He's without comparison. Also, there is his position. The Bible calls him the high and lofty one, the most high. In fact, sometimes you can think about the different life forms that are in existence. Well, we start off perhaps with the little viruses down the bottom. Very irritating, aren't they? Viruses. But they're a very simple life form. You come up, perhaps arranging things in pyramid fashion, maybe to the insects, then up to maybe some of the simple forms of life, the fish and things like that. Then you come up to the mammals, and then you perhaps come up to eventually man, then you come to the spirit creatures. But you know, the very peak of that pyramid is always going to be Jehovah God. He's without comparison. There's no comparison. Also, we think about his eternal existence. Yes, again, we know from our study of the Bible that Jehovah God will give everlasting life, even immortality, to certain creatures into the future. But only Jehovah can look back on an eternal past. No start to it. It's difficult for us to even comprehend things like that, isn't it? And so it should be according to the Bible writer Job, or the Bible account of Job. Jehovah is without comparison. Also, we think about his personal glory. The Bible calls Jehovah the Father of the celestial lights. Now, that's really speaking about his own personal radiance, his magnificence as an individual. Of course, we know that no man can look at Jehovah God and live. The Bible tells us that. Other beings we can look at and live. But we're talking about the source of dynamic energy. Why, human beings, with our eyes, we can't even look at the nearest star and go without damage. Only Jehovah God is without comparison because of his own magnificence, his personal being so radiant. We also think about Jehovah God's marvelous attributes. He alone is omnipotent, infinite in power. You look out at the universe and you see these huge heavenly bodies held in an orderly fashion. Why? It's because there's someone infinite in power. Why, recently I was trying to understand a scientific journal that someone had given to me, trying to describe a black hole. Have you ever heard of black holes? Now, this scientist was putting it in layman's terms. I still couldn't understand it really. And he said a black hole could be likened to a drain plug, designed to pull matter and then recycle it. Do you know, they say the power of a black hole is so great that even light cannot escape it. It's difficult for us to understand that, isn't it? And yet I was lying in the bath afterwards, as you do after reading things like that, just to recuperate. And the bath in the circuit flat, the plug leaks. And you know what you do when you're in the bath and the plug leaks? You put your heel in it, don't you? And I couldn't help but think that black holes that powerful, Jehovah God, being infinite in power, he can make them, turn them on, turn them off. That is the person we're speaking about. It's good to keep that in mind. Also, he is omniscient. Now that's speaking really about infinite wisdom. Now it's good to keep that in mind also, because that would indicate that at times, because we are not omniscient, we do not have that font of knowledge and wisdom that Jehovah God has, that does mean that at times he will direct us to do something, and being imperfect human beings with a limited view on matters, we will want to do something else. But we can trust in this person, Jehovah. He can take everything into consideration. Infinite in wisdom. Also, his works of creation, he alone is the creator. He is the only source of life, Jehovah. And of course, his name and fame. He alone bears the name Jehovah. It means he causes to become, in other words, he's unstoppable. He can cause himself to become whatever is necessary to accomplish his purpose. 7 different ways in which Jehovah God is without any comparison anywhere. But you wrap them up in a warm, compassionate nature, and that is the person we have the privilege of getting to know. However, there is one quality that Jehovah has that quite often people try to ignore. People think if they bury their head in the sand like an ostrich, this quality of Jehovah will just go away. Today we're pointing out, it will not go away. The quality? Let's open our Bibles to the 94th Psalm and find out all about it. Now we're going to be reviewing the whole of the 94th Psalm, so if we have a marker, it would be wise just to place it here. And we'll see why we're going to review the whole of this psalm as we go through it. It really is almost fine-tuned to the needs of Jehovah's servants in these last days. Let's find out. The quality that people try to ignore that Jehovah has, it's in verses 1 and 2. It simply states, O God of acts of vengeance, Jehovah. O God of acts of vengeance, beam forth. Raise yourself up, O judge of the earth. Bring back a retribution upon the haughty ones. Did you see the quality of Jehovah God spoken of there? The one that people try and hide away from. He's a God of vengeance. Now today, that word vengeance quite often has a negative connotation. You think about some shifty character, a member of the mafia. And years ago, there was some perceived slight against a family member, so he's been looking out for vengeance since then, and he stands there with his collar upturned in a dark alley, waiting for someone to walk past so he can leap out and wreak his vengeance. It's underhanded, dirty. It's someone who doesn't want to go through the legal system because they're afraid of the consequences. Well, don't think that the word vengeance here means that. It literally means from justice. In fact, if Jehovah God was not a God of vengeance, he wouldn't be loving, he wouldn't be merciful, he would not be just. It's a necessary quality. But did we see upon whom this vengeance is going to come? Did you see right at the end there, the last stanza of verse 2, it says, bring back a retribution upon the haughty ones. I'm sure we'd agree that this world is full of haughty people. Just think about the world of science, for instance. Now, we're not saying that all scientists are wicked and haughty, arrogant people. In fact, many of them, very interesting to get to know them if we possibly can, to read some of their works. We quote extensively from it. But we have to say that the world of science contains some extremely arrogant people. And why we say that is because even though it's blatantly obvious that there is a creator. Even though people like ourselves, we've got to know him on a one-to-one basis. They have tried to remove him from the picture and replace him with an unproven, unprovable theory. That smacks of haughtiness and arrogance. But Jehovah's got them in mind. How about also the word of politics? Well, you have to say that if you ever see a politician in a church, it's usually because there's been a disaster. And he views his attendance there as a photo opportunity. Now, some may view that as slightly cynical, but I'm afraid we'd have to be, well, a little silly, really, if we thought they went to church for other reasons at times. You see, even if they did go because of a sincere belief in there being a God, just think of how haughty and arrogant they really are. They say, yes, I recognize there is someone out there with the intelligence to design all of this and the power to make it all, but I think I can rule it better than he can. That's arrogant. Of course they can't. They should be submitting to his rule. Jehovah's got them in mind. And of course, finally, the world of religion. Isn't it true? It's full of arrogance. Imagine someone saying they represent the God of the Bible, and then they close the book or misquote it and try and propagate their own theories and ideas as to what God's standards are. Haughty and arrogant. Doesn't it disturb us when we see some of the things done by such ones on the earth today? And quite often they blame God when things go wrong. We look forward to Jehovah acting with vengeance against these individuals. But no doubt in our mind there's a question. It's probably the same question that the psalmist David raises in the next few verses. Let's take a look. He says from verse 3, how long are the wicked, O Jehovah? How long are the wicked themselves going to exult? Oh, they keep bubbling forth. They keep speaking unrestrained. All the practices of what is hurtful keep bragging about themselves. Your people, O Jehovah, they keep crushing. And your inheritance they keep afflicting. The widow and the alien resident they kill. And the fatherless boys they murder. Now, we're not going to deny, we couldn't deny that these awful things take place. In fact, it could well be that we're sitting here now and we're thinking, well, we're doing our utmost to serve Jehovah God, but we can see that we're in the situation mentioned in verse 5. Do you feel crushed? Do you feel afflicted? We'd have to be a callous person not to feel crushed at times. So why doesn't Jehovah God act? How long are these ones going to have the upper hand? That's what the psalmist David was saying. Is that a question that we think about? It's true, it's bound to be there. How long? If Jehovah God really is a God of love and a God of power, why doesn't he do something for his people? Don't forget, Jehovah God is omniscient. And he stands back and he sees things from a completely different perspective than we do. And there is very, very good reason for Jehovah not to have stepped in up until this time. And we can understand what the reason is by going back in history and looking at other occasions when Jehovah God did step in on behalf of his people, but only at a specific time. Let's do that now. Let's go back to the time when the Assyrian king Sennacherib was running rampage throughout the ancient world. Now, he was a haughty, arrogant man, but he was fear-inspiring as well. Imagine being in Jerusalem, knowing full well that Sennacherib and his armies were racing through your homeland. What would it have been like? What feelings would we have had if we awoke in the morning, stood up on the ramparts and looked out, and we saw, just coming over the horizon, another column of smoke. They've torched another village. And that's the village perhaps where our family live. You know, these Assyrians, they were extremely cruel people. They viewed it as an art form to be able to peel the skin off of people but keep them alive. They've actually recorded, you can go to the British Museum and read it, they've recorded how long they could keep people alive. They boasted about torturing, ripping out tongues, and all these things would have been known. It was a fear campaign that they carried out. And we can see that column of smoke coming over the horizon from where our family, our loved ones, live. Would you feel crushed? Would you feel afflicted? Of course we would. Questions? Why hasn't God acted? Why is he allowing this to go on? Then, of course, we even get that haughty individual. He must have been quite a character. His name was Rabshakeh, spokesman for Sennacherib. And he comes up against us. We're walled up in Jerusalem, and he stands down there on the ground, and he shouts up to us and states, "You people are fools. You think your God Jehovah's going to save you? Look around the nations. Have their God saved them? No. You're all going to die if you don't submit." Why hasn't God acted? Why hasn't he squashed this haughty little man? He's waiting for the right time. And Jehovah waits until Sennacherib comes up and actually camps around the walls of Jerusalem. He actually makes a stand like a schoolyard bully, almost coming face to face with Jehovah God and trying to stare him down. And when the issue is very, very clear, is Jehovah almighty, or is Sennacherib and his gods mightier? When the issue is that clear, Jehovah, he sends one angel, and in one night, he wipes out 185,000 of those Assyrians. Now, we don't know how he did it. If you look at ancient historians, some of them mention a plague that swept through the Assyrian camp. We just don't know. It could well be that Jehovah God just turned off their life force. We don't know. But do we see the point? Jehovah waited until the issue was very, very clear. And then he acted. You see, as Jehovah's people at this point in history, our difficulty is not really waiting for Jehovah God to act. Our problem is misinterpreting what's going on. And David knew that would take place. That's why he wrote what he did in verses 7 through 11. Now, let's look very carefully at what he's really saying here. Some misinterpret Jehovah waiting for the right time. Let's read it. In verse 7, it just says, "And they keep saying, Jah does not see, and the God of Jacob does not understand it. Understand, you who are unreasoning among the people, and as for you stupid ones, when will you have any insight? The one planting the ear, can he not hear? Or the one forming the eye, can he not look? The one correcting the nations, can he not reprove? Even the one teaching men knowledge. Jehovah is knowing the thoughts of men, that they are as an exhalation. Nothing. Nothing. Even the most intelligent of men is nothing." But did you see how one's misinterpreted things? Because Jehovah didn't act in their time scale, and they saw ones doing things that were wicked and seemingly getting away with it, they thought that the God of Jacob didn't see. They thought he was blind, so they therefore thought, well, we can do things that are rotten and wicked, and we can get away with it. And as soon as you get that thought, even the inkling, the seed of it into our mind, it'll fester away until in the end we fall into a most dangerous trap. It's a trap that was dealt with regards to, the article that deals with this is the Watchtower of 91, June the 15th. Now, usually we don't give references out, but we're told to give this one out. And for good, we'll understand why as we go through it. He was actually speaking about, will you pass a test of Christian loyalty? Now, just think about what's being said here, and we'll understand how it ties in with what the psalmist David said. One young man said, you don't think of immoral conduct as disloyalty. He said, you're just simply having fun. True, you know that if your parents or the elders were to find out, it would cause heartbreak and a lot of problems. But when you're simply having fun, you just block all those thoughts out. This young man then led a double life. He deceived his parents and the elders in the congregation. But let's face the facts. That's not hard to do. It's not hard to deceive your parents. I can remember being a young man, I deceived mine. Did you deceive your parents? I think we all do to a certain extent. How about the Christian elders? Well, they're just men. You could deceive the Christian elders, yes. You could lead a double life. There's nothing difficult about doing that. But do we realize that when we're doing it, Jehovah God is observing and we are failing the test of Christian loyalty? You see, committing gross wrongs such as fornication is a very serious matter, but we can actually compound our difficulties if we try and hide over what we really are. But leading this double life is self-defeating. It's dangerous, isn't it? You see, wrong acts unchecked almost always lead to other wrong acts. And while initially our conscience is troubled, the longer one persists in wrongdoing, well, in the end, our conscience just dies, doesn't it? We see no problem in wrongdoing then. We cease feeling pain. Now, at that point, it becomes extremely difficult to get help and assistance. And then, strangely enough, even though we're failing the test of Christian loyalty, another misguided sense of loyalty comes into play. This one young lad who was quoted at the beginning, he said this, now just think about it. Where does his loyalty lie? To Jehovah? He said, you realize what you're doing, and you know that it's wrong. But in order for the other individuals involved not to get into trouble, you all get together and agree not to tell anyone. Look at the 94th Psalm. Does Jehovah see? Can he hear? The God who made the eye and the ear, can he see and hear? Of course he can. He sees all these things. What did he call them there who actually misinterpret the fact that Jehovah God doesn't act? In verse 8 he calls them stupid ones. And remember, a stupid one in the Bible is someone who has the ability to reason, but they use that ability to reason in a wicked way. I can do bad things and get away with it because no other human being sees it. That is a gross misinterpretation of Jehovah waiting for the right time. At this moment, we are going to appeal that if any can see that they are leading a double life, that they clarify that situation now while there is time, because the time is running out. Don't be caught out by thinking that Jehovah God is blind, deaf, and not a God of vengeance. He's appealing for us to come and set matters straight between us and him. Why not accept that invitation, that appeal, and benefit from that little part of this talk? Benefit from it by doing something about it. You see, we actually look forward to the time when those who lead double lives will no longer exist. We look forward to that time when there will be no more double standards. We long for it. We've been praying for it. It'll exist when Jehovah's heavenly kingdom extends its authority over the earth. It'll soon happen. But who are the ones who are going to be there and benefit from it? Well, look at verses 12 and 13, because they're described here. He says, "Happy is the able-bodied man whom you correct, O Jah, and whom you teach out of your own law, to give him quietness from days of calamity, until for the wicked one a pit is excavated." Now, do we see the contrast between the ones mentioned in the first stanza of verse 12, the able-bodied man whom you correct, and those mentioned in verse 2? The ones in verse 2 are haughty, arrogant. No one's telling me what to do. In verse 12, they've been corrected, willing to be corrected by Jehovah God. Are we like that? Remember, he doesn't expect us to be perfect, because if he were to be perfect, well, why would he give us correction? He knows we're going to be just like we are here now. We've got all our faults, our failings, our flaws. They're all there. Jehovah God knew we would have them. But he said, "You'll be happy if you allow me to correct you." Are we like that? Are we looking out for Jehovah God's direction? Are we like those who Jehovah God will teach out of his own law, so that in the end we can actually gain the mind of Christ? That's what the Bible says. And of course Jesus Christ's mind reflects that of Jehovah God. So we can see things as Jehovah God saw them. It's a realistic thing to expect that we can become adherents willingly of Jehovah God's standards. If, and here's the if, the big if we are humble enough to accept his direction and do our best to put it into practice. Don't expect perfection. Just put the effort in and be willing to accept that direction. And if we do, well, in verse 13 it says we're going to have an easier life. Quietness from the days of calamity. Just think of some of the things that Jehovah God has told us in the past. Now, don't think I'm having a go at anybody here, but isn't it true that a number of years ago we were told, for instance, that if we get ourselves into debt, we become a slave to the person who has made the money available? Now, we were given that advice decades ago. Who's benefited since? The ones who humbly accepted it, or the ones who thought, no one's telling me what to do? It's the ones who didn't get themselves into debt. They've benefited. How about those who accepted the direction to keep their life simple years ago? Who benefited? The ones who accepted the direction, or the ones who didn't? Sadly, I know brothers who were so up to their neck in debt. Do you know, life for them is a real struggle. If you accept Jehovah God's direction, you'll get the easiest route through. Of course, the wicked one who completely rejects it, well, there's a pit excavated for him. We can't deny the wicked who reject Jehovah's direction will not exist in the very near future. So what's the result if we allow Jehovah God to direct us? Well, that's mentioned in verses 14 and 15. Isn't it true? We'd love to have this feeling it's mentioning here. It says, "For Jehovah will not forsake his people, nor will he leave his own inheritance. For judicial decision will return even to righteousness, and all the upright in heart will follow it." Do you ever feel that Jehovah God has forsaken you? Do you ever feel that? Being honest, right down deep inside, do we ever think of our life and think, well, do you know, I'm being punished here for things that have happened in the past? If only I had done things differently. Jehovah never forsakes those who do their best for him. We might have to suffer the consequences, the eventualities of our actions in the past, But Jehovah will not forsake us if we do our best for him. Now we have to keep pushing that thought into our mind, because Satan will say to us, yes, Jehovah God's going to abandon you. You might as well go into the world and make good use of it. But Jehovah guarantees, even though at times we may misinterpret some trial, some tribulation coming upon us as if we've been left to one side, that is just not the case. He says there, he will not leave his own inheritance. And that's us. Now, are we close enough to Jehovah God so that even when times become extremely difficult, we can turn to him in prayer and get that feeling that we are not forsaken? Jehovah's not far off from any one of us. If we reach out for him, he'll be there for us. And who else is there? Look at verses 16 and 17. David said, who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Well, no one will, except Jehovah. Who will take his stand for me against the practices of hurtfulness? And there are plenty of them, aren't there? No one will, except Jehovah. Unless Jehovah, he says in verse 17, had been of assistance to me, why, in a little while, my soul would have resided in silence. Jehovah is the one we should turn to and make our secure height now. And you know, although we think about the great tribulation that's coming, and will we survive that, we can also say that Jehovah can be our secure height from this day onwards, if we draw closer to him. And in so many marvellous ways. There's a lovely experience that we're to recite or relate. It's drawn from a South American country. Now, we're not going to say which South American country this is, but suffice to say, it's one of those countries where people just go missing and are never seen again. And we're not going to irritate the governmental forces to make things more difficult for our brothers. But just keep that in mind. This is one of those countries where people just go missing. You've seen them on the news. All these widows, or these women, they don't know if they're widows or not, do they? What an awful existence. This is that type of country. Now listen to this. Now, one of our brothers was a former union official. He'd studied with Jehovah's people, accepted the Bible as truthful, and he became baptized. He got baptized. Now, in the same month of his baptism, he was stopped on the way home from work by the military police, who demanded to see his identification card. Well, when he presented it, they couldn't believe them. They struck gold, because they thought, as he was a former union official, he must be a communist. They bundled him into the back of the truck and sped off. He asked if he could contact his wife. They said no. They drove him out into a pound right out in the middle of nowhere, really. He was blindfolded. It was a barbed wire enclosure. He was locked up with about 100 other men who were all suspected of being communists. There were also some hardened criminals amongst them. Now note this, there was one man there who was charged with the murder of 6 other men. There was also a journalist there. Well, at night it became very cold. The men were given no bedding. They were told that they were to be treated like animals and to curl up on the ground, just go to sleep if they could. Every morning, the commanding officer commanded all of them there to stand up and sing the national anthem and salute the flag. Now, there's a problem for our brother. Respectful, but he couldn't do it. Now, it would seem that the other 100 men in this pound used this as an opportunity to ingratiate themselves with the army officers, because they then started to attack our brother. He was in a barbed wire enclosure with 100 men, including hardened criminals, who were attacking him. His wife, he knew, would have been worried sick. He didn't know if he was ever going to see her again. Emotional, physical pressure. Is Jehovah God going to abandon him? Well, every meal time they all ridiculed our brother because he said a little prayer. He really went through a terrible time, heckling him, wouldn't let him sleep, etc. But then on the third day, Jehovah started to show his power on behalf of his people. Something strange happened. After all the men started to ridicule our brother, the criminal, the one who'd murdered 6 people, he went over to all of the men and said, I've been listening to you guys for 3 days now. The next one that says something bad about this Jehovah's Witness is going to be number 7 on my list. Things started to change. He said, believe me, I'll find a way of shutting you guys up for good. Well, he must have been a persuasive character, because that same day, the men called our brother over and asked him if he would pray for them. He prayed for them at the meal table. He actually, well, it would seem they organised themselves so we could give them a public talk in this barbed wire enclosure. But it was still, the pressure was still there. Every afternoon a number of prisoners were taken away for interrogation. Some never came back. They don't know what happened to them. Others came back, and they're all glassy-eyed. It's evident that they've been drugged. Well, on the 9th day of going through this, do you know how long 9 days lasts when you're under that sort of pressure? Seems like 10 years, doesn't it? Well, on the 9th day, it was the turn of our brother. Blindfolded again, taken to the interrogation point where he was severely beaten and questioned for 8 hours. In reply to their questions, he just told them about Jehovah and Christian neutrality. Of course, they couldn't believe it because he'd only been baptized a month. Their decision was that they would hang him. They informed him, asked him if he had any last words. He said, well, will you tell my wife and my children what's happened? They said no. They asked him if he was not afraid to die so young. He said, well, if you'd picked me up 7 months ago, I would have been very afraid of dying. But the Bible says that death's just like sleeping. I know that Jehovah will resurrect the dead. Then perhaps ironically he turned to the guard who was beating him and said, one day you too, sir, will have to face death. They took him to the gallows. Our brother was praying for Jehovah to keep him faithful and also to care for his wife and children. They put the noose around his neck. The order was given to release the trapdoor, and then there was that awful fraction of a second while they were waiting for the rope to tighten. He'd been faithful right up to death. Very interesting, the rope did not tighten. He just fell to his feet. It had been a ruse, a trick, to see if he backed down at the last moment. After they saw he wouldn't, and he was genuinely a Jehovah's Witness, he was blindfolded again, handcuffed, driven to the place where he'd been taken, seized 9 days before, and dumped. Now, he had a rough time of it. It had hurt. Emotional pressure, physical pressure. But Jehovah hadn't abandoned him. And even, of course, if that rope had tightened, Jehovah had not abandoned that man, that brother, our brother. It's interesting, because that 9th day was a Sunday, he knew where he would find his wife and children, because they also made Jehovah God their secure height. And he went to the Kingdom Hall and found them. I think the way it finishes is nice. It just says, it was as if he had been resurrected when he walked in. Can you imagine that? Do you think Jehovah God could do the same for us? Keep us strong so that we're loyal to him no matter what. Do you know he will? If we make him our secure height now. And we are going to see some devastating things. Look at verses 18 and 19. Perhaps we feel this is us already. He said, when I said, my foot will certainly move unsteadily, your own loving kindness, O Jehovah, kept sustaining me. When my disquieting thoughts became many inside of me, well, your own consolations began to fondle my soul. Do you feel your foot is moving unsteadily at times? Sometimes we feel as if the next step we're going to falter and we just cannot go on anymore. And then we think about what we've done in the past and all those thoughts come flooding back in. We think, why bother? I'm tottering now. I might as well just sit down rather than fall. And some of us have actually reasoned that way. But you know, it speaks in that last stanza of verse 18 about Jehovah's loving kindness. Now that little term, loving kindness, is worthy of a little bit of study. Because loving kindness really means loyal love. And it's speaking about a quality that Jehovah God has, whereby he sticks himself to his servants. And even though they go through those rough periods where it would seem by an outsider they're not doing much for Jehovah, but they're staying loyal to him, and he is going to be loyal to them. And he sticks to them until his purpose with regards to that individual is accomplished. And his purpose, he wants us to get life. He's not going to abandon us because we can't do what we did in the past. He's not going to throw us away because we're going through an awful emotional situation that means we cannot do what we'd like to do for him. He's not going to throw us away. The ultimate test for Christians is endurance. And if we just keep enduring, doing what we can, rest assured, Jehovah, he's stuck to us. And he'll help us get through. And the disquieting thoughts, well, David said he had lots of them. They became many inside of me. We all get them. Do we allow Jehovah's consolations to fondle our soul? Do we get absorbed in what the Bible tells us? Do we really read what the slave class are telling us, or do we scan through? If you want Jehovah to fondle your soul and just say to you in effect, and give you the feeling so that you know he's saying this, don't worry, don't panic, calm down, you're safe. If you want that feeling, bury yourself in God's word, the Bible, and the information from the slave class. Sometimes we can't do a lot, can we? I know myself, I've been under so much pressure at times that all I can do is stare at the pictures. Do you find that? There's that picture with the lion and the beach ball. Do you remember that picture? A sister actually cut it out for me. I've got it by the side of the bed. And sometimes all I can do is I can just stare at that picture. And though it might sound a little strange, but after a while I can put myself in the picture. And when I'm in that picture in the new system, all the problems that I face at this moment, well, do you know, they just drift off. And I feel calm. Because Jehovah God's fondling my soul. We can get that. He won't force it upon us, but we can get it if we study his word, the Bible. Keep our finger there just for a moment. We're just going to go back to the 9th Psalm and the 9th verse for good reason at this point. Because sometimes we can feel to ourselves that we've gone too far to be rescued by Jehovah. Notice what he says here, the 9th Psalm and the 9th verse. Well, do we see who Jehovah God is a secure height for? He says, and Jehovah will become a secure height for anyone crushed. He doesn't say for anyone going through the crushing process. He says crushed. Completely flattened. We feel absolutely wiped out. But Jehovah God is still going to be our secure height. Times of distress, we're going to get them. But did you see again? When the difficult times come, Jehovah said he's not going to abandon us. He'll be our secure height. Maybe we've already had those difficult times. Maybe they're coming. But never forget Jehovah. Draw close to him in prayer. That process, just pouring out our thoughts to him, can calm us down. Use it. Let's go back to the 94th Psalm, because we're going to go through the next little section, pointing out that we could get difficulties way, way beyond the limited individual emotional level that we've been speaking about. Verses 20 through 22. Will the throne causing adversities be allied with you, while it is framing trouble by decree? They make sharp attacks on the soul of the righteous one, and pronounce wicked even the blood of the innocent one. But Jehovah will become a secure height for me, and my God the rock of my refuge. Framing trouble by decree. Satan's done it before. He's trying to do it now. It's quite likely he'll succeed in the near future. A whole legal system trying to crush Jehovah's servants. Right, recently, I'll give you the date. The Thursday, July the 22nd, 1999, all European newspapers carried that legal notice. Did you see it? It was for us. Did you not see that? Very good. Now that's actually entitled to victims of Nazi persecution and their heirs who may have claims against Swiss banks or other Swiss entities relating to the Holocaust. Now, because of pressure being put on those Swiss banks, they've agreed to settle $1.25 billion US. Who's affected by this settlement? Well, it says, you are affected by the settlement if you fit into one of the following 5 settlement classes. 4 classes consist of victims of or targets of Nazi persecution. That is, any individual, business or group persecuted or targeted for persecution by the Nazi regime or its agents because they were or were believed to be, please note, Jewish, Romani, Jehovah's Witnesses. Did you see it? Satan framed trouble by decree. One of the most horrendous systems, governmental systems the world's ever seen. All this pressure, Satan said, I'm going to crush these Bible students. Did he? Did Jehovah abandon them? When they were in the concentration camps, did Jehovah God leave them? When they were dying, even when they died, Jehovah didn't leave them. We'll see those ones in the new system if we make Jehovah God our secure height like they did. We will see devastating things come up against Jehovah's people. Are we ready for it? We're going to be amongst those who will see the things mentioned in verse 23, our concluding verse. And he will turn back upon them their hurtfulness, and will silence them with their own calamity. Jehovah, our God, will silence them. They're going to be hurtful, but Jehovah's going to turn it back against them. It'll seem as if they have the upper hand, and all of a sudden Jehovah will reverse the table. They're going to try and silence us, but we'll never be silenced. We might go a little quiet, but we will never be silenced. Why? Who's our God? He's omnipotent. Who is our God, Jehovah? Is he one to abandon his loyal servants? Has he ever done that? Are we going to be the first one? No. Do we see what we're being told via this 94th Psalm? Now is not the time to lead a double life and think we can get away with things. Now is not the time to be drawn into that world to try and make life as easy as possible for us by gaining material things. Now is the time to plan ahead for eternity. Now is the time to be determined not to be amongst those who do actually falter and flaw. Now's the time to draw closer and closer to Jehovah God and make him our personal secure height.